She didn't have high expectations for her life. She grew up in a poor neighborhood where dreams were often overshadowed by the harsh reality of survival. But there was something in her soul, a silent force, that propelled her beyond the limits imposed by society. Her name was Clara, a young woman of only 24 years old, full of ambition, but without the means to achieve it. When she heard about the marriage proposal, she didn't hesitate. It was a unique opportunity, and she knew it was a risky move, but one that could change everything. The CEO, Daniel Harrington, who was in a coma, was a man known for his intelligence and power. The company he had founded was one of the largest in the industry, but the accident that knocked him unconscious left him in a vulnerable condition. Clara didn't know much about him personally, but she knew enough to understand that this was the chance of a lifetime. The contract was clear: marry him and stay by her husband's side until he awoke or the company faced bankruptcy. He had been in a coma for over 6 months, and doctors said the chances of him waking up were minimal. Clara saw it as a transaction, a lifetime monthly payment in exchange for her dedication. The promise of a life of comfort and security was enough to make her accept the offer. What she didn't know was that her marriage to Daniel wouldn't just be a financial arrangement. She would soon discover that what attracted her most to him was something she hadn't considered: his feelings. And those feelings would make her question her own morality. The first day at the hospital, when she was by his side for the first time, was strange. Clara felt a knot in her stomach, but the sight of her new life kept her grounded. The hospital room was cold, the monitors making the monotonous sound of a machine that, despite its technological beauty, seemed to offer no hope. She looked at Daniel's face, thinking about how different he could be now, so far from what the tabloids said he was. Weeks passed, and Clara grew accustomed to the routine. The hours at the hospital, the daily visits, the doctors who gave hopeless reports. Sometimes she caught herself looking at him longer than necessary and wondered if he had some kind of power over her, even unconsciously. But it was just an illusion, she told herself. He couldn't touch her or love her. He was lost, trapped in his own mind. She couldn't expect anything from him. It was on a winter night, with a fierce storm raging outside, that everything changed. Clara was tired, but a feeling of loneliness compelled her to return to the hospital later than usual. When she entered Daniel's room, his appearance seemed almost angelic in the dim light of the lamp, as if he were simply waiting for the right moment to wake up. She approached, touching his cold hand, and something inexplicable happened. Clara felt an impulse, an energy that seemed to emanate from Daniel, something she couldn't control. She leaned over him, and in an impulse, without words, kissed him. What happened next was a surprise to both of them. Clara woke up the next day with a strange emptiness and a confused feeling that her life had taken an irreversible turn. And to her surprise, when the pregnancy test came back positive, the reality of her gesture took shape. Clara wasn't the type of person who easily surrendered to her feelings. She grew up in an environment where survival was the priority and where relationships were often based on convenience. Her mother, a warrior woman, always said that the world doesn't give anything for free. It was with these words that Clara learned to live with her feet on the ground, and the only thing she had, besides her health, was her intelligence. Her life was a daily struggle to escape the cycle of poverty, and when she saw a chance to enter the world of the rich, she didn't hesitate. But unlike many around her, she didn't dream of luxury. For Clara, all she wanted was stability. The hospital where Clara spent so much time accompanying Daniel was a reflection of her new reality. The white walls and cold corridors were more familiar than she cared to admit. She didn't know if it bothered her because of its lack of comfort, or because the hospital represented a life she had no control over, a life that depended on what would happen to Daniel. And yet, it was there, in that place of uncertainty, that she began to find a strange sense of belonging. Daniel, on the other hand, was an unattainable figure. His body remained motionless, but his legacy and the grandeur of his past life permeated everything around him. The company he had founded was one of the largest in the country, and his colleagues, now under the leadership of his brother Jacob Harrington, continued to pressure Clara to make important decisions about the company's future. She, however, found herself torn. She didn't know what to do with this sudden power that had been given to her, a power that seemed more like a responsibility than an advantage. The contrast between Clara and Daniel was evident. She, rootless in a world of wealth, trying to adapt to a life she hadn't chosen, and he, immortalized in photos and reports, a living legend with every possible luxury and an uncertain future. While Daniel was trapped in an inert body, Clara had the freedom to act, but this freedom came with the weight of a loveless marriage and a responsibility she didn't know if she could bear. Jacob Harrington, Daniel's brother, was another character who began to enter Clara's life in a way she didn't expect. Jacob didn't seem as concerned about Daniel's well-being as he should have been. For him, the main concern was keeping the company running. And with Clara's contract, he had an ace up his sleeve. Unlike Daniel, Jacob was pragmatic and calculating, always seeing situations as opportunities to maximize profits. At first, he seemed to see Clara as a pawn in his game. But over time, he began to realize that she was more than that, something more that he couldn't quite define. Clara's relationship with Jacob was complicated. She felt a mixture of distrust and attraction towards him, but she knew that any involvement with Daniel's brother could destroy what little stability she still had. However, Jacob was not someone easy to ignore. He had a strong presence, a way of speaking and acting that captivated those around him. But Clara kept her distance, aware that any mistake could be fatal. Meanwhile, her life continued to follow a tense routine. Weeks passed, and Clara's pregnancy became increasingly evident, something she tried to hide even from herself. She didn't know what to do with the fact that she was carrying the children of a man who might never wake up. With each visit to the hospital, she wondered if she would ever have the courage to tell Daniel if he ever did wake up. But until then, she was alone, pressured by the expectations of everyone around her. She knew she couldn't go back. Clara's pregnancy was not just a surprise to her, it was a true moral dilemma. When the first signs appeared, Clara was in shock. She didn't know what to think. The twin pregnancy further complicated her situation. She was already trapped in a marriage she didn't want, a life imposed upon her, and now, suddenly, she found herself with 2 children carrying the weight of a responsibility she hadn't chosen. What would she do with this new life? And more importantly, what would this mean for her future and the company's? Jacob, for his part, quickly realized something was wrong. He had become increasingly involved with Clara, not romantically, but strategically. He began pressuring her to make decisions that would directly impact the company's future. At first, he seemed to respect her situation, the pain of losing her husband in a coma, but he soon made it clear that he wouldn't allow the company to be dragged into limbo because of a woman incapable of taking charge. He accused her of being weak, of not understanding the gravity of the situation, and provoked her with a silent psychological game. He knew Clara was vulnerable, and he used that against her, suggesting that Daniel could wake up at any moment, but that the company couldn't wait any longer. The pressure on Clara increased every day. She was torn between 2 worlds: her responsibility to Daniel, who was still alive, and the obligation to ensure the continuity of the company, now in Jacob's hands. More and more, she began to question whether this marriage really had any meaning. What was she doing? She was sacrificing herself for money and stability, but what was she losing in the process? Her own identity, her dreams. Clara's conflict was no longer just about what to do with the marriage and the pregnancy. Now she was wondering if there was any way to escape the clutches of this reality without having to lose everything she had achieved so far. But as the pregnancy progressed, she found herself increasingly connected to the idea of having Daniel's children. Even if he never woke up, those babies represented something she had never had: hope. However, the situation with Jacob only worsened. He began to insinuate that perhaps Clara had no choice but to take a step forward with him, both personally and professionally. He made comments about the future of the company and how things would be much easier if she simply surrendered. But Clara knew the solution wasn't simple. She still loved Daniel, or at least the idea of what he represented. She couldn't allow Jacob to take complete control of the situation, but she also didn't know how to prevent it without losing what little she had gained. On a particularly tense night, while Clara was at the hospital watching over Daniel in his coma, Jacob appeared unexpectedly. He entered without warning, as if he knew she was there. Clara didn't appreciate the invasion of privacy, but the tension between them was palpable. Jacob approached and, with a calculating smile, asked, "Have you thought about what we're going to do when he wakes up, Clara?" If he wakes up. His words echoed in her mind. Clara wanted to respond, wanted to scream that she wasn't ready to deal with the consequences of her life, that she didn't want to be a pawn in Jacob's game. But instead, she remained silent. What could she say to a man like him, who already controlled so many pieces around her? The conversation was interrupted by an unexpected phone call. It was news from the doctor. Daniel's vital signs had shown a slight improvement. But something about that call didn't seem right. Clara felt a chill down her spine, as if everything around her was about to crumble. What did this mean? Was Daniel starting to wake up? She hung up the phone, and the silence in the hospital grew even heavier. Jacob watched her with interest, as if he saw in that moment an opportunity to finally have complete control of the situation. He knew the turning point was near, and Clara, more lost than ever, had to face an inescapable truth. Her life was about to change in a way she couldn't have foreseen. With the news of Daniel's improvement, tensions began to intensify. Clara felt as if she were balancing on a tightrope between her husband's medical progress and Jacob's pressure to take complete control of the company. While she tried to remain calm, life around her seemed to turn into a giant game of chess, and Clara was increasingly aware that she could no longer be a spectator. Jacob, with his skill in manipulating the situation, began to pressure her more directly. He summoned her to meetings with investors and business leaders, seeking to ensure she made decisions on his behalf. But with each meeting, Clara grew more uneasy with the way Jacob treated the company as his own, as if Daniel's legacy were merely a tool for his own interests. He knew she was in a vulnerable position and used this to his advantage, never making it clear how far he would go to achieve his goals. However, Jacob's pressure wasn't the only thing that was becoming difficult to handle. Clara was also beginning to feel the effects of pregnancy. Weeks passed, and Clara's belly became visible, sparking a series of questions and speculations in business circles and the media. She found herself forced to create a facade, maintaining a public image of control, while inside she wondered about the future. How would she cope with all this? What would she do with the children to come, especially if Daniel never woke up? People around her were beginning to wonder if her marriage to Daniel was nothing but a sham. Some were starting to question Clara's loyalty, while others were getting closer to her, trying to exploit her weaknesses. Her own feelings were becoming more confused. She no longer knew if she was doing all this for money and stability, or if there was something more that attracted her to Daniel, something she couldn't define. And then there was Jacob, always lurking, trying to infiltrate her life further, as if waiting for the right moment to play his last card. Meanwhile, Clara was also grappling with an emotional dilemma. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt for Jacob. He was charismatic, intelligent, and knew exactly how to control a situation. But what bothered her most was the fact that she knew she was, in a way, being manipulated. Jacob didn't see her as a person, but as a key to unlock doors in the corporate world. The tension between them increased with each encounter, and Clara knew that sooner or later she would have to make a difficult decision: continue playing Jacob's game and lose herself in the process, or find a way to walk away and fight for what she truly wanted. The pregnancy, in turn, seemed to be forcing Clara to mature quickly. She knew that regardless of what happened with Daniel, she would have to be responsible for the children. She began to imagine what life would be like with twins, what it would be like to raise two children in such an uncertain world. But there was something she couldn't understand. Did she truly want to be with Daniel, or was that just an illusion created by the situation? What if she were capable of being happy alone, without depending on anyone? These questions echoed in her mind, without clear answers. But the greatest challenge was yet to come. Clara was beginning to realize that the real battle wasn't just between her and Jacob, nor between her and society. The real struggle was internal. She needed to discover who she was, beyond the woman married to a man in a coma with an uncertain future. Clara wanted to be more than a pawn in someone else's game. She wanted to be the master of her own destiny. And while she pondered all these questions, Daniel's recovery seemed closer than ever. But what would she do when he finally woke up? Daniel's situation finally began to change. After weeks of gradual improvement, the moment Clara both feared and longed for had finally arrived. Daniel began to show clear signs that he might wake up. The doctors were cautious, but Clara couldn't hide her apprehension, and at the same time, a sense of relief. What would happen when he woke up? How would she cope with it all? The fact that she was carrying her children made everything even more complicated. The idea that he might remember the woman she had become during this time and what he would think about it terrified her. But the turning point didn't come with Daniel simply waking up. When he awoke, Clara was there, standing beside his bed, unsure how to react. Daniel's tired, lost gaze met hers. He seemed confused, but there was also a strange perception in his eyes. He didn't recognize her immediately, and that left Clara with a bitter taste in her mouth. All this time, she had devoted herself to him, or to what she thought was him. She had cared for him, waited for him, but now, as he awoke, it felt as if she were a stranger. The first thing Daniel said, his voice hoarse and weak, was, "Where am I? What happened?" Clara swallowed hard, trying not to show the turmoil raging inside her. He seemed completely lost, as if he didn't even know who he was. The doctor said it was natural, given the time he'd been in a coma. But for Clara, this was the major turning point. She no longer knew how to define her own identity. She was married to a man who didn't even recognize her. However, what truly changed the course of history was Jacob's visit shortly after Daniel's awakening. Clara knew he was watching from afar, but what she didn't know was that Jacob already had his own plans. He entered the hospital room with a confidence that seemed excessive. He looked at Daniel, who was still confused, and then at Clara with a superior smile. "Finally awake, Daniel. How are you feeling?" Jacob asked, as if he were the most important person in the room. Clara, however, felt a chill. Something was wrong. Daniel, now more lucid, looked at Jacob with an expression Clara couldn't decipher. The tension in the air was palpable. Jacob, with a cold calm, approached Clara and in a subtle tone said, "Now that he's awake, I think we can start discussing what really matters, can't we, Clara?" His words resonated in her ears like a challenge, a silent provocation. It was at that moment that Clara realized the true nature of the game being played. She wasn't just being manipulated by Jacob, but also by Daniel. When he woke up, he wasn't as oblivious to the situation as she thought. He was observing everything, analyzing everyone's movements, and Clara finally understood that although he was in a coma, he had always known more than she imagined. What she thought was an opportunity to escape Jacob's control was now revealing itself as yet another trap. Daniel wasn't an innocent victim in this game. He was playing too. The biggest shock for Clara was the revelation that Daniel, throughout her coma, was aware of everything happening around her. He knew about the deals, the manipulations, and even the pregnancy. He knew about Jacob, he knew about the pressures she was facing, and somehow he had planned it all. He had his own agenda, and what seemed like a simple accident, an opportunity to escape, was actually the beginning of a meticulously orchestrated plan. Clara's reaction was immediate. She moved away from Daniel and Jacob, feeling a wave of anger and disbelief. How could he have done this? How could he have let her believe she was alone, that he didn't care, when in reality he was manipulating everything? She didn't know whether to feel relief or disgust. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about her choices, had been shattered. Now she was faced with two men, one who had controlled her from the beginning, and another who was back, but with ulterior motives she couldn't fully comprehend. The reversal was clear and painful. Clara was no longer in control of her life. She never had been. Clara was lost. The weight of the revelations of the last day crushed her with each passing moment. She never imagined that Daniel's return would be so impactful. The man she believed had devoted himself to her, silently, was more aware than she imagined. And Jacob, with his strategic behavior, had taken advantage of every second of Clara's vulnerability, manipulating the situation without remorse. She distanced herself from the hospital for a while. She needed space to think, to organize her feelings, which were more confused than ever. The pregnancy, now advanced, seemed a constant reminder that she couldn't simply disappear. The consequences of her actions were materializing, and there was no way to ignore them anymore. As Clara distanced herself from Daniel, she also distanced herself from Jacob. But this wasn't simple. Jacob wasn't someone easy to ignore. He knew exactly where she was, what she was doing, and didn't hesitate to contact her, always in a cold and calculating manner. Clara realized that his control over her life was much greater than she had imagined. He knew she was at a breaking point and used that to his advantage. Jacob, with his relentless charm, began to attack where it hurt most: the company. He suggested to Clara that she make decisions about the future of the business, implying that if she didn't, he would take complete control, with or without her approval. He had always wanted to be the leader, and now, with Daniel in a coma and Clara in a state of confusion, he felt stronger than ever. But what he didn't know was that Clara, even in her vulnerable state, was not a woman willing to be completely subjugated. While Jacob made his moves, Daniel, now more aware and sharp-minded, began to take stock of everything. Conversations with the doctors, the staff, and even the discussions Clara and Jacob had had while he was in a coma began to reach him. Daniel was no longer a spectator. He had become the main player, and for the first time, Clara felt the situation was slipping out of her control. He knew more than she wanted to admit, and his words, still fragile but intense, began to make Clara question all her choices. She knew she couldn't continue being a spectator in her own life. Something needed to change, and the answer to that no longer lay with Jacob or Daniel. The answer lay within herself. It was on a particularly tense afternoon, during a visit to Daniel in the hospital, that Clara made a decision. He was in his bed, stronger, more lucid, but still emotionally distant. When she entered the room, he looked at her differently, as if he were expecting something from her. The words he said, though simple, were the breaking point. "You knew everything, didn't you?" Clara finally understood that the real manipulation didn't come only from Jacob. Daniel had also manipulated her, perhaps in a more subtle but equally powerful way. He had used her to ensure his company stayed afloat, while simultaneously making her believe she was doing good. Clara felt used, like a disposable piece in a corporate chess game where she never had control over the rules. Anger and resentment consumed her, and that's when she made the decision that would change the course of her life. She could no longer be controlled by either man. The company, the pregnancy, the marriage, everything needed to be put into perspective. Clara knew that her true freedom began with a difficult choice. She needed to distance herself from both of them. She went to Jacob, confronting him directly for the first time. He watched her with an arrogant smile, as if he already knew that, at some point, she would give in. But Clara was no longer willing to be manipulated. She made it clear that she would no longer be part of his plans. She cut ties with the company, and for the first time, felt in control of her own life. Jacob wasn't surprised, but his words were laden with an implicit threat. "You can't run from this, Clara. There are things you can't control." But Clara no longer cared what he thought. She was ready to take the reins of her own destiny, even if it meant losing everything she had achieved so far. With Daniel, the situation was more delicate. She knew he wouldn't understand her immediately, but she also knew that if she wanted to truly live, she would need to distance herself from him as well. She could no longer be the woman who sacrificed herself for something that was no longer real. Her life, her children, and her independence were what she wanted most now. Clara took control of her life, without knowing exactly what the future held, but with the certainty that she would no longer be controlled. After deciding to distance herself from Daniel and Jacob, Clara found herself on a solitary yet liberating journey. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she needed to rebuild her life from scratch. Her advanced pregnancy was a milestone that forced her to be even more resolute. There were days when she was afraid of what she was doing, but something stronger motivated her, the need to be in control of her own life. Clara began to understand that her strength lay not in following others, but in remaining true to her own principles. She started to focus on her own identity and the future of the children she was carrying. The social pressure surrounding her pregnancy, which had previously made her feel embarrassed, now became a symbol of her resilience. Every move she made, every decision she took, was geared towards the future she envisioned for herself and her children. The path would not be easy, but Clara was willing to face any obstacle. She sought a new direction. She left her life in the hospital behind, distancing herself from the environment that kept her tied to a past that no longer made sense to her. Clara began to explore other career options. She knew she couldn't depend on anyone. The investments she had made with Daniel's money were more stable than she had imagined, and over time she realized she could use her intelligence and skills to build a new empire. But now, an empire that was genuinely her own. Clara's relationship with Jacob weakened over time. She no longer felt the need to prove anything to him, and he, in turn, realized that Clara was no longer the woman he could manipulate. When he tried to contact her again, she was clear in her response. "You no longer have power over me." Clara's words were simple, but powerful. She no longer needed him to validate her existence. She was reinventing herself, creating a new version of herself that didn't fit anyone's expectations. Meanwhile, the pregnancy progressed, and Clara prepared for the birth of the twins with a new focus. She wanted to be a strong and independent mother, someone her children could admire. She sought a new space to live, away from the memories of the past, and began to surround herself with people who respected her for who she was, not for what she represented. The following weeks were a time of great transformation for Clara. She began to establish new relationships, new business contracts, and even to get involved in charitable projects. What had previously seemed like a life destined for suffering and submission was now becoming a story of overcoming adversity. Clara realized that, throughout her journey, she had learned to trust herself. The woman she had become was stronger, more resolute, and with a clearer future than she had ever imagined. The difficulties hadn't disappeared, but Clara now had a different perspective. She understood that the biggest obstacles weren't outside of her, but within. Self-acceptance was a lengthy but fundamental process. She learned to forgive herself for the choices she had made and to face the truth that no one else had the right to define who she should be. She didn't need Daniel nor Jacob to be successful. The only person she truly needed was herself. The birth of the twins was a crucial milestone. Clara, who had previously felt fear and insecurity, now saw herself as the heroine of her own story. Her children represented everything she had achieved and at the same time, everything she could still achieve. She was ready for the future. Each day, Clara felt she was getting closer to becoming the woman she had always wanted to be. The woman who didn't bow down to others, who took the reins of her life, who made herself heard, and most importantly, who commanded respect. Clara's story was no longer about being a submissive wife or a victim of circumstances. It was about the woman she chose to become, a strong, independent woman, and above all, free. Now Clara knew that her true transformation was happening within her, and that the world she was creating for her children would be much more than a simple reflection of her survival. It would be a reflection of her strength and determination. Clara, now with twins on the way and a new life unfolding before her, could no longer afford to ignore the shadow of the past. Even with the strength and independence she had gained, something still remained unresolved. Daniel, despite having woken up, had not yet truly assumed his role in her life and the lives of their children. His recovery was slow, and although he had tried to reconnect with Clara, she still had many doubts about his return. She knew that deep down he would never again be the man she had known. Jacob, on the other hand, did not give up. He still believed that Clara was somehow within his reach, and the messages and attempts to contact her began to intensify. He knew that to succeed in his own plans, he needed Clara by his side, and he would do anything to ensure that. His manipulation now became more subtle, more disguised, but there was still an air of threat in his words and actions. Despite the apparent serenity Clara displayed, the weight of the final decision rested on her shoulders. She knew she could no longer continue living between the past and the future. The woman she had become could no longer look back, nor could she continue allowing these two men, who had dominated her life in such distinct ways, to dictate her destiny. The big event that would define his future was approaching. Daniel's company was at a crossroads. Either it took control of the situation, freeing itself from Jacob and the shackles of marriage, or it left everything in Jacob's hands, who, with his manipulative skills, was already planning to use the company as a bargaining chip for his own advancement. Clara knew she needed to act now. The birth of the twins would be a turning point, a chance to prove to herself that she could fully recover and make a choice that would set her free forever. The weeks leading up to the birth of her children were a period of strategic preparation. Clara ceased to be merely a woman waiting for her moment. She became a strategist, planning her next steps to ensure her life would no longer be a pawn in anyone else's game. She negotiated with lawyers and investors and began to strengthen her own alliances. The connection with the company was severed, but Clara knew she couldn't simply walk away without setting things straight. She didn't want to destroy Daniel's legacy, but she also knew she couldn't allow him to be used as a tool for manipulation. She then did something no one expected. She called a meeting with the company's main shareholders and investors. It was time to put a definitive end to that story of control and manipulation. Clara knew she could no longer be the submissive wife or the marginalized woman. It was time to assert herself and show the world that she was in control of her own life. Jacob was furious when he learned of the meeting, but he knew that with Clara's new leadership, he no longer had power over the company. He would try to play dirty, but he could no longer manipulate the situation to his advantage. As the meeting approached, Clara was prepared for the final confrontation. It wasn't just about saving the company or deciding her future with Daniel. It was her chance to finally make peace with what she had experienced so far and move on. Her decision was no longer about others. It was about herself. The birth of the twins would be the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. She was about to make a choice that would change everything. Soon, she would discover that, in the end, true strength didn't come from fighting others, but from fighting herself and her own doubts. What would she do when the final decision was made? The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon. Clara felt a mixture of nervousness and determination in her chest. The investors were already gathering in the conference room, and Jacob, with his imposing presence, was there, waiting with a cynical smile. He thought victory was within his grasp. He knew Clara was vulnerable and that in the end she wouldn't have the courage to make the difficult decision. After all, she had always been controlled by him or by Daniel. Clara entered the room with a composed expression, but a suffocating anxiety coursed through her veins. The meeting began like any other, with presentations and reports, but Clara knew that this meeting would not be like the previous ones. She had a crucial decision to make. She looked around the room and saw the expectant gazes of the investors, all awaiting the final word on who would be in charge of the company. It was the final battle for control of Daniel's legacy. Jacob, who was already sitting confidently in his chair, watched Clara with a smile. "Now that you're here, we can finally resolve this, can't we?" he said, not hiding the irony in his voice. "You know what to do." Clara looked at him, feeling her anger bubbling, but also a deep sense of purpose. He didn't know it, but she was playing a different game now. It no longer mattered who was right or wrong. What mattered was what she wanted for the future. With a calm gesture, she asked for the floor, interrupting the murmurs in the room. When all eyes turned to her, Clara began to speak in a voice that reflected the strength she had gained over the past few months. "The time has come to do what's right for me and my children," Clara said, looking intently at Jacob. "I'm not here to discuss deals, power plays, or manipulation. I'm here to ensure that my family, my future, and my independence come first." Jacob, trying to maintain his composure, replied quickly, "You have no choice, Clara. The investors are already committed. What you do here is irrelevant. The future of the company, our legacy, depends on it." Clara smiled, but with renewed confidence. "The future of the company doesn't depend on who controls what. It depends on who truly believes in something greater than power and money. And I believe in what I can build on my own." The silence that followed was tense, with all eyes fixed on her. Jacob, who had always believed himself invincible, seemed uncertain for the first time. Clara knew she was in control of the situation, more than she ever had. She had finally understood that she didn't need Jacob's or Daniel's validation to define who she was. Without another word, Clara turned to the investors and presented her proposal. It wasn't an aggressive move, nor an attempt to destroy everything Daniel had built. She proposed a new path, a shared future, but one in which she would be the leader, making the decisions herself, no longer subservient to Jacob's power games and no longer bound by Daniel's legacy. She proposed a partnership with the investors to create something new, but without forgetting the roots of what Daniel had built. A fusion of innovation and respect for legacy. The room fell silent as the investors considered her words. The tension was palpable, but Clara knew she was on the right track. It wasn't just a fight for the company, it was a fight for control of her own life. She felt that by finally taking responsibility for her own story, she was creating a stronger future for her children, for her family, and for herself. Jacob tried to fight back, but his words no longer carried the weight they once did. He realized, for the first time, that he had underestimated Clara. His manipulation game no longer worked. He was no longer the puppet master. Clara had freed herself not only from Daniel, but from everything she thought she needed to be someone. In the end, the investors agreed to Clara's proposal. They were willing to bet on her vision, on her potential. She had proven to everyone that she was more than just the wife of a CEO. She was a woman capable of leading, innovating, and creating a new story for herself. As the meeting drew to a close and the investors left, Clara sat for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had won. But not just the battle for the company, she had won the battle for her life. When she looked out the window, she felt for the first time that the future was in her hands, and that nothing, neither Jacob nor Daniel, could steal that freedom from her. The cool morning wind streamed through Clara's office window as she gazed out at the city. Life, in all its ups and downs, had transformed before her eyes. The weeks following the pivotal meeting had been filled with change. The birth of the twins brought a new perspective, an even stronger reason to keep the fight alive. Clara now saw herself not only as a strong and independent woman, but as a mother responsible for a bright and promising future for her children. The company was doing well with the new structure under her leadership. Clara made sure to maintain a balance between respect for Daniel's legacy and the innovation she brought to the table. But her greatest triumph wasn't in financial success or professional victories. Her greatest triumph was in her personal transformation. She had finally freed herself from the shadows of Jacob and Daniel. Although both remained in her life in some way, neither had the power to control her trajectory. The man she loved, Daniel, was now recovering, trying in some way to rebuild what had been lost. However, Clara knew that true rebuilding had to come from within, and she was no longer willing to be a pawn on someone else's chessboard. As Clara gazed at the twins, who slept peacefully in their crib, she felt at peace for the first time in years. She knew that with them, she not only had a new reason to live, but also a constant reminder of her own strength. They were proof that even in the darkest moments, there was light, growth, and transformation. She thought of Jacob, who was now trying to rebuild his own life, but she knew he no longer had control over her. In the end, he and Daniel had become characters of the past, who, however important they had been in her life, were no longer the drivers of her destiny. Clara was now the architect of her own story, and this, more than anything else, brought her a profound sense of fulfillment. The decision to distance herself from them, to no longer be the submissive woman or the victim of their games, had been the turning point in her life. Clara not only overcame the difficulties, she learned to use them as fuel for her personal journey. Now, she did not fear the future. She knew that the path ahead would be shaped by her own strength, by her own choices. The twins would grow up in a home full of love and freedom, far from the manipulations of the past. And Clara knew that as the days went by, she was building their future based on what she had always sought: independence, happiness, and above all, the power to choose their own destiny. She smiled at the twins and with a heart full of hope whispered to herself, "I did it." Years later, Clara looked back with a gentle smile. Her children, now teenagers, were becoming incredible people, full of curiosity and courage. She knew her journey would never be easy, but she was at peace with everything she had accomplished. Daniel's legacy and Jacob's maneuvers no longer defined her. She had become someone who, alone, had created something lasting. The future was, finally, in her hands. But in the silence of her nights, she sometimes wondered, how far would her journey take her, and what did destiny still have in store for her? If you've made it this far, then you've probably felt as immersed in Clara's journey as I have. Now it's your turn. Share this story with your friends. Discuss the impact of Clara's choices and how the fight for independence can change a life. What would you do in her place? Would you also make such courageous decisions? Tell us what you thought and follow Clara's journey. Her future is just beginning. Let's reflect together.